My name is Jack Turner, and in 1943 I was 21 years old and convinced that the sky belonged to us. I grew up in Ohio, fixing tractors with my father and building model airplanes out of scrap wood, dreaming of flying something bigger than a crop duster. When the war came, I signed up for the Army Air Forces the first week I was old enough, certain that being a bomber pilot would be the quickest way to end the war and get back home. By the time this story begins, I had already flown 23 missions over occupied Europe in a B-17, and people had started calling me a veteran, as if surviving statistics made you bulletproof. The morning of my 24th mission, they woke us before dawn and marched us into the briefing room that smelled like coffee and sweat. A big curtain covered the map at the front, and we all pretended not to care where they would pull the string this time. When the cloth dropped, a red line stretched from our base in England deep into the heart of Germany, ending at a factory complex we were told was vital to the enemy war machine. The colonel talked about altitude, formations, and fighter escort, but what stuck with me was one line on the board: estimated losses acceptable. It is a strange feeling realizing you are part of a number someone has already decided is acceptable. Hours later, the runway blurred under our wheels as our B-17 rumbled into the air, heavy with fuel and bombs. From my seat in the left-hand pilot's position, I watched the English countryside fall away and turn into a patchwork of clouds and sea. Behind us and beside us, dozens of other flying fortresses formed up, their silver bodies catching the weak winter sunlight, until the formation looked almost beautiful. The intercom crackled with routine checks, jokes we had told a dozen times before, the forced laughter of men who know how quickly beauty can turn into falling metal and fire. By the time we crossed the German coast, the clear blue sky had turned into a dirty gray ceiling, and the first black puffs of flak appeared ahead of us. At first they were far away, like harmless dark flowers blooming in the air, but within minutes they were close enough that I could hear fragments rattling against the fuselage. To our right, another B-17 suddenly lurched, one wing dipping as an engine burst into flames. I watched 3 tiny figures tumble out, parachutes barely opening before clouds swallowed them. I remember thinking very calmly, that could have been us, and then forcing my eyes back to the instruments, because fear does not keep a bomber level. The burst that found us came from below and behind, a punch we never saw coming. The plane shuddered as if a giant hand had grabbed the tail and tried to rip it off. Warning lights flared on the panel, and the roar of the engines turned uneven and sick. The intercom exploded with overlapping voices, the waist gunner shouting about fire in the fuselage, the top turret yelling that we were trailing fuel, the navigator cursing as his table flipped over. I fought the controls, but the B-17 began to slide out of formation, losing altitude like a wounded animal dropping out of a pack. Somewhere behind us, German fighters smelled blood and turned in our direction. Our captain, sitting to my right, met my eyes for a single second, the kind of look that contains more words than a speech. He pushed the alarm bell and shouted into the intercom, "Prepare to bail out. This is not a drill." And I felt a cold wave run through my body. Training tells you the sequence: grab chute, clip in, head for the hatch. But training never talks about the photographs of burned pilots everyone has seen on the bulletin boards. As I left my seat, I touched the control yoke one last time, like you might pat the neck of a horse you're about to abandon. The B-17 had been our home. Now, it was a burning building we had to escape. When I stepped into the open hatch, the wind tore the breath from my lungs and the world flipped upside down. For a moment I was spinning, the aircraft shrinking above me, one wing still on fire, pieces of metal tumbling alongside like deadly leaves. Below, the neat patterns of German fields in a small town grew larger with terrifying speed. I pulled the ripcord, bracing for the jerk, and the parachute opened with a crack that felt like my spine had snapped. For the first time, suspended between the burning sky and foreign ground, I had time to wonder not whether I would die, but how much the people below hated the silhouette drifting toward them. I landed in a muddy field on the edge of a village, crashing hard enough to see sparks behind my eyes. Before I could disentangle myself from the parachute lines, voices surrounded me. Angry, afraid, speaking German too fast for my limited training. An old man swung a pitchfork toward me, not quite close enough to stab, but close enough to make his intentions clear, while a woman screamed about bombs and children and fire. I raised my hands, repeating, "Nicht schießen, Amerikaner Kriegsgefangene," over and over, the words clumsy on my tongue. Someone finally shouted for the police, and the pitchfork lowered, but the hatred in their eyes stayed. And for the first time I understood what our raids looked like from the ground. They delivered me to a gray stone building that could have been a town hall or a prison. In wartime, sometimes it is both. A German officer with tired eyes and a neat uniform sat me in a chair under a bright lamp and asked for my name, rank, and serial number. I gave him exactly that and nothing more, just as we had been trained, my voice sounding strangely calm in my own ears. He tried the usual tricks, pretending they already knew everything, insisting that cooperation would mean better treatment, hinting that my crew were dead because of my stubbornness. What unnerved me most was not his threats, but the way he occasionally rubbed his temples as if this war had exhausted even him. Eventually, they chained a group of us together, Americans, British, even one Canadian, and loaded us into a freight car that smelled of coal and old hay. Through the small barred window, we could see Germany passing by. Bombed-out factories, unscathed farms, children waving or staring in silence. One man tried to joke that at least now we were finally flying first class, but the laughter died quickly. We were all picturing the missions we had flown over these same tracks. At night, the car grew so cold that our breath formed clouds, and yet no one complained, as if speaking out loud might break the thin layer of shock that kept us functioning. At some point I realized I was no longer a pilot or an officer, just cargo being shipped deeper into enemy territory. The POW camp was surrounded by double rows of barbed wire and guard towers that looked almost bored in their familiarity, like something copied from a textbook. Barracks of rough wood and thin roofs held more men than they were ever designed for. Bunks stacked 3 high, straw mattresses that smelled of old sweat and disinfectant. On my first night, a veteran prisoner named Miller explained the rules. Roll call twice a day. Never approach the wire. Never look too interested in the gates unless you want extra attention. He also explained something else, that the real enemy inside the camp was not the Germans, but boredom and hope, fighting each other inside your skull. In here, he said, you either find a way to keep your mind busy or it starts eating itself. Winter arrived like a slow tightening of a fist. Our breath froze on the inside of the windows. The thin blankets turned into stiff boards overnight, and the soup got thinner as the guards complained about rations too. Sometimes on clear days, we heard the distant rumble of aircraft engines and rushed outside, squinting up at the sky like thirsty men staring at clouds. We could not tell whether the bombers were American or British, whether they were hitting factories or cities, but we knew that somewhere above those clouds, men like we once were still flew. Standing there in our ragged coats, I realized I was now afraid of those planes in a way I had never been afraid of German flak. It is different when the bombs might fall on the roof above your own head. One night, the distant rumble grew into a roar, and the searchlights near the camp snapped on, lancing the sky with white spears. Sirens wailed from a nearby town, then from another farther away, the sound overlapping like a chorus of panic. The guards shouted for us to get into the trenches they had dug as an afterthought along the barracks, protection from enemy air activity, they called it with bitter humor. As explosions thudded in the distance closer than ever before, I lay in a narrow trench pressed between men who smelled of fear and fatigue, thinking how strange it was to be hiding from our own side. In that moment, I stopped seeing the war as lines on a map and started seeing it as circles of pain that kept expanding until everyone was inside them. Months later, rumors began to seep into the camp, the Russians advancing from the east, the Allies from the west, cities falling like dominoes with names we could barely pronounce. One morning, the guards at the towers were simply gone, and in the distance, we saw tanks with white stars instead of black crosses. The gates opened not with a heroic charge, but with a cautious push, and suddenly we were free men who did not quite know what to do with their freedom. Back in America, there were parades and speeches, flags and handshakes, and people called us heroes, expecting us to smile and nod on cue. But at night, I dreamed less about flying and more about the faces in that German field looking up at our bombers, and about the guard who quietly slipped me an extra slice of bread the week his own brother died in an air raid. Now, decades later, my hands shake when I pour coffee, but not when I write. I decided to tell this story not because I think my suffering was unique, but because most stories about bomber crews end either in glory or in flames, and very few talk about what comes after the parachute opens. People ask if I regret volunteering, and I always answer the same way. I did what I thought was right with the information I had at the time. What I regret is how long it took me to understand that every target on a map is a place where someone like me lives, works, loves, and prays. If there is one thing I want you to remember from this old pilot's confession, it is this. In war, the distance between us and them is about as thin as the fabric of a parachute and just as fragile.